The good old clap, take one.
That's right.
How many of you knew what you wanted to be when you were 7 years old? I did. I wanted to be world champion.
Hey, is there honesty involved in this podcast? Can we be honest?
You can shut your fucking lips.
And then I'll just say, put them up, what? Let's go.
He's like, you look too pretty on the wave. Get ugly.
We can talk about DMT if you want.
I thought we were boxing.
All right, we have the Jamie Brisick on the lineup today. Jamie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dave.
How are you doing today? Where are you today? Who are you hanging out with?
I'm in Malibu. I'm alone. I spent the morning writing. I got up around 5 in the morning and worked for a long time. And I looked at the surf, and it's kind of windblown. So I went for a bike ride, and now I'm back home.
Is that your routine normally? Are you an early guy as opposed to a night owl?
Yeah, I kind of am both, and I write a lot. But I find the morning to be really productive, and I normally I'm more kind of banker's hours, as they call it. You know, I get in the chair by 9 and sort of sit till noon, and that's like a big session, and then later field other stuff. But no, I've been on this kind of pre-dawn thing which has been great. And yeah, it's really nice.
I read somewhere that the director, Robert Rodriguez, his program is he doesn't even get out of bed. He just pulls his laptop on top of him in the morning and like writes for like 3 hours. That's his deal. And I'm always fascinated in other people's writing processes because there's no real model. You're just trying to be like, oh, would that work for me or would that work for me? And in the case of Robert Rodriguez, I'm like, that would not work for me at all. I would just kind of roll back over to bed.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I've been doing it for a while now. But the thing about writing is it's sometimes almost what can be very productive work cannot feel like work. And if you apply a lot of sort of conventional ideas to it, you can feel like you're wasting time. But I mean, sometimes a walk can be very productive. But I relate to that, and I get up really early. You know, my rhythms go all over the place, but lately I meditate first thing in the morning, and then I read the news, and then I might read something, and then I'll sit and write in bed and make notes in bed, and it can be really productive. But there's that thing with writers where it's like, you know, you're very productive in your pajamas, which just it sometimes feels like you have to really dig deep to keep your self-esteem up, because while you might be writing something really good, you can just feel like you're sort of sick and ill and not healthy and withdrawn from people.
I feel like maybe the entire world's gotten a little bit of relatability to that, being in COVID, where they're working from home and they're like, do I need to put pants on today? I don't know. Like, am I feeling productive? And you hear people talk about it all the time where they're going, man, my routine just got blown apart and I'm in this malaise of living where I don't everything's blurry. I don't know where my personal life and my professional life end and where's my structure. And but I guess if you're a writer, you've kind of been dealing with that for a long time and having to develop your own kind of rhythms.
Yeah, no, my joke early quarantine was that I was quarantined all along. I was sort of training for this time. But it's true what you say, and I see it in so many people I know, and myself included, where it's taken a toll. And I don't even want to say it's necessarily like a negative thing, but it's just people are changed by it. And I think the rhythms are different. The energy levels are different. The light in people's eyes is sometimes really dim compared to what it was. And but, you know, on the flip side, I think of like the values and the, you know, me being like an ambitious writer living in Los Angeles, my kind of my competitiveness or my self-esteem being dictated by how well I'm performing work-wise, like we've been humbled, and it's sort of like if you're in good health and you've got a smile on your face, you're doing great, you know.
Right. Well, you said two things in there I want to unpack. You mentioned how it's impacted everyone, and I hear it at the World Surf League, and I hear it like friends hear it at their companies, and there's sort of this element in society that is very much geared towards, well, when things get back to normal, when things get back to the way they were, et cetera. And at least in my circles, it seems like there's a louder voice collectively that is, we're going to get through the pandemic, but the way things were before, whatever it was, work-life balance, you know, capitalism, government, you know, race relations, was not good. We shouldn't go back to that. Like we've changed forever, so we will never go back to that. And I'm curious what your thought is on that too. Do you think there will be kind of a complete correction back to what it was pre-pandemic, or do you think we're all kind of forever changed after this collective experience?
Definitely forever changed. I mean, I think
Mm.
so much has happened, and so much has happened that we've yet to even process. And I think, so much has happened. And I don't think there's any going back. I think we're kind of revising our values. I think a lot of it's been really, really good. And I think, we're just sort of finding a way through this new world.
The second thing you mentioned was about, your inherent competitiveness in being a writer. But as of, October 2021, like how would you define your career as a writer at the moment? Do you have sort of regular gigs? Are you freelancing? Are you working on specific projects? How do you kind of go about your week in terms of projects that you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, I feel very fortunate. I have stuff to write every day, and at this point, I have sort of enough to keep me busy for the next 5 years. I know what I'm going to be doing. I have a very sweet deal with a gig, you might call it, with Birdwell, where I write a blog for them called The Dazzling Blue and in California, and that's a regular thing that I do. I write a lot of stuff for the Surfers Journal. I've been working for 11 years now on a film about Peter Druin / Westerly Wendina. And that's going to have a life in 2022, which I'm very much looking forward to. And then I've been writing a memoir for a long time. So, it goes back and forth. I mean, the thing with writing is it's often just terrifying in terms of you can put a lot of time and energy into something that you don't even know. I'm working on something right now that I don't have a publisher for. There's no deal in place. There's no advance that I'm living comfortably off, but I believe in it. And it's like a leap of faith most of the time. But thankfully, I mean, I've kind of lived in a way. I've lived simply. I kind of learned this from being a pro surfer. I'm very comfortable hand to mouth. It's not. I don't need a huge sense of security or a kind of big cushion underneath me financially to feel like I'm okay. So I throw myself into my projects, and my like safest place is just to be writing, feeling like the writing I'm doing is good, and doing it every single day, and keeping a good rhythm with that, and sort of putting in the honest hours, and that fulfills me. And financially is another story. So I don't look good on paper to a lot of people my age, but I also do fine, and I'm really, really comfortable, and I really love my lifestyle, and I sort of am very happy and grateful for it.
It sounds like you're working on like so many different projects, and also even within writing, just it's not all novels and it's not all screenplays. Like it's a little bit of everything. Has that always been the case with you in your writing career? Have you always kind of liked I guess for lack of a better phrase, like a potpourri of options in terms of how you want to express yourself through writing?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I sort of backdoored my way into writing, and I came to it late. I was a pro surfer from 1986 to 1991. And I traveled, while I was on the road, a part of me opened up that I didn't even really realize was happening. I thought I was chasing surf contests and getting in the top 30, which was like getting in the 44 at that time. And I was, but at the same time, I was experiencing all this stuff. I was reading a lot. There was a lot of solitude. There were a lot of really, really long flights and layovers in countries where I knew no one, and I would be in a hotel room and I would, be reading, jet lagged, and then I would take a walk around the place. And there was this part of myself that really opened up. And when my career finished, I'd been reading steadily. I've been keeping journals, and I saw my friend Andrew Kidman, who was the then editor of Waves magazine, and I said, "Hey, I'm off the tour." I was living in Sydney, Australia at the time. I said, "I'm off the tour, and I'd really love to write some stuff for your magazine." And he said, "Well, your timing is very good. I need an associate editor." And I instantly got hired on to be the associate editor of Waves magazine. So I spent a year in Australia doing that. And then I moved back to LA, where I'm from, and I started freelancing. And at that time, it was really just trying to hustle up jobs. And so I did that for a long, long time. But I had a kind of realization or epiphany, you might call it, about 15 years ago, where I realized I do this thing that I love so much. I love writing. I love putting words down on the page. But I realized, like, the type of writing I'm doing, it's not earning me a lot of money. And so rather than waiting for editors to assign me pieces, what I need to do is kind of make this my own and pitch to the editors the pieces that I really want to write. And if I'm not going to earn a lot of money doing this, at least have something I'm learning or something I'm trying to discover. And so I very consciously started doing that. And once I started doing that, things got much better, because everything I was writing about were things I was interested in, or something I was trying to learn and sort of resolve within myself. And I think that led me to doing more memoir type stuff, personal essays, things. And a lot of it is, I'm now at a stage where I can kind of mine my past and go into things that are really hard and difficult. So some of the writing I do feels like I'm just sort of bleeding, and I sometimes don't know whether I'm wallowing in the past and in pain and trauma, or whether I'm resolving something. And that I never really know that, but I've done a lot of personal writing about my brother's death, my late wife.
Yep.
But then I do a lot of stuff that's incredibly fun and light and easy, and it involves like driving to go hang out with someone cool for a few days and write a profile of them. So there's this balance of sitting alone in a room and possibly losing my mind, and being out and hanging out with great people and, and absorbing their stories, which is really fun.
Do you have any? There's so much there I want to unpack, but just that last point of saying, there's times when I feel like I'm in a room by myself and I'm bleeding on the page and losing my mind. And even before, where you're talking about these different sort of formats that you write in, do you have any just personal tools in terms of discipline of, oh my God, I'm moving into a space that's not going to be healthy for me. I'm realizing this, I need to do these things to kind of break myself out of it? Or do you have kind of people in your life that you check in with when that's happening? Or even just from an efficacy standpoint of, I'm avoiding the format or the subject that I need to do to get paid in favor of this thing that's easier for me. Do you have any sort of like disciplinary things that you work on personally, just to make sure that you can kind of keep moving through your day?
I think about what you just said. I think about so much, and it's kind of like this central question for me all the time, or central tension. And there's no easy answer, and there's no real knowing. Like for instance, for a long time, I've been working, and I've sort of published various pieces of it, but I've been working on this long memoir. While I was a professional surfer, my brother had a bad drug problem, and he eventually overdosed fatally. And so at one point while I was working on this memoir, I decided to sort of ride my bike around the neighborhood where we'd lived at that time and where he died. And it was this thing where as I was doing it, I was thinking, is this like research, or is this wallowing in the past? And there's that with things that are way less sort of overtly sad than that. There's memories, right? And you're sort of tracking these memories, and it's sort of like, are you just miring yourself in your past? Why aren't you living in the present? Why? But in many ways for a writer, that's sort of the material you have. And that's the stuff that I can write about with utter conviction. Mm-hmm. But no, I never know. And I never know. And it's mysterious, and the whole writing process is mysterious. I mean, there are times when I will, sip wine in the night and write my way into stuff. And I'm not sure if that's an alcoholic at work, or is that a productive writer at work? And it's so interesting. And I think about this a lot because I was a pro surfer, and it was a very clear-cut way of being productive. It was physical fitness. It was clearing your head. It was having the best boards. I mean, there was a lot of mystery in how you fall into rhythm with the ocean during a heat, right? But there were there were the intangibles and there were these tangibles. And those tangibles were things that were almost militant. It was almost like you were in the army and you were like doing your push-ups and doing your, all the stuff that you would do to be a great athlete. Whereas writing, and I guess art making, creativity in general, it does come from places that are way less, they're less definably productive. And I have a lot of artist friends, and a lot of them are on edge. And I know can sound like an utter cliche, but there is a place where you sort of can be inspired that is more on the edges of yourself. And it may not be this like firm handshake, fit body, clear eyes. It can be in a part of yourself that's withdrawing, but you're going into something that's deep and very fruitful in terms of the art making.
Yeah, this is so interesting to me because, growing up, it's a pretty common archetype to get exposed to, that, the artist is someone who has a lot of trauma and someone who has a lot of complications. I think it's Marvin Gaye or someone said, like, great artists suffer for the people, right? And as I've gotten older, I have met people in the art world or even just sort of creative people who are pretty well adjusted. And they're like, no, like you don't have to you can create great art or great music or great writing, and you can live a fairly level life. But as a writer yourself, I was curious to get your take on that archetype of like the long suffering, very complicated, tragic artist.
And I never want to romanticize it, and it's not something I ever recommend. And I by no means am I saying that sort of all writers are that way, right? Like I have several friends who write for the New Yorker, and the deadlines that they have to hit and the levels of research. It's more scholarly, academic. It's more rigorous. But a lot of the writing that I've chosen to take on is personal essay or memoir. So the subject matter or the topics are sort of there's pain there, and so that's been my experience. But by no means I would never. That is a dangerous kind of archetype. That the like Vincent van Gogh, I suffer for everything. I've definitely fallen into it myself. And then when I was younger, I thought that was romantic, and a lot of the writers I looked up to were that. And I thought, oh, how cool! I can be kind of a drunk and be a poet at the same time. At this stage of my life, I've gone far enough to realize like there's a upright level of energy and focus that you have to hit to get the work done. So it's been de-romanticized for me.
Interesting. Well, let's wind the clock back a little bit, because you were born in the 1960s in the Los Angeles area.
Yeah, I was born in '66, and I lived for the first 6 years of my life in the Encino Hills, at the top of up near Mulholland, kind of in the Santa Monica Mountains. And then we got into skateboarding up there, and then we moved out to Westlake Village and lived there from age 6, 7 to up until the time I started traveling on the tour at age 19.
And what did mom and dad do? And you mentioned your late brother. Was he your only sibling as well?
I have two brothers, one surviving brother and a younger sister. So my brother, we all got into skateboarding. The three brothers got into skateboarding very young, and then that kind of fed us into surfing. And then shortly after, once we got really serious about surfing, punk rock came. And punk rock was fantastic because we lived in suburbia. We were kind of rebelling against a lot of conventions that we couldn't quite articulate, but we would just felt like we were sort of different kids. And I'm probably all kids felt that way. But in any case, we felt when punk rock came along, it sort of articulated this thing that we felt. And sadly, my oldest brother got deep into it and found drugs. There were a lot of drugs on the scene in that time, and got badly addicted. And that was a long process that eventually took his life. But my father, he passed away 2.5 years ago. He was a publisher's representative. He sold textbooks to the universities in the greater Los Angeles area. The dinner guests when I was growing up were, heads of departments at the universities, professors, very academic. My mom was a mother up until she became a mortgage broker and did that for a long time. My middle brother, Steven, surfed a ton. My younger sister did not surf, but we were all very close. And I come from a very close family.
Your comment on, suburbia and punk rock is interesting. And I think there's almost a bridge to the conversation we were having before about the archetype of suffering artists. I grew up in suburban Orange County as well. And there is something about it. And I think so much about the suburban experiment of sometimes it works almost too well in the sense of everything is so curated. And in Orange County's case, like very white, like very Christian, like a lot of money. And it just doesn't, it feels like your life is wrapped in cotton wool. Like all the experiences feel plastic in a way, right? And so, and I think I must have been, late grade school, early, middle school, maybe when punk rock was a big deal to me too. Getting exposed to things like Minor Threat and Fugazi and being like, this feels just more visceral and real, and it's probably even more potent for kids from suburbia because it's just like the relativity to that backdrop is really intense. Does that sing to you at all, like in terms of like your experience?
No, and you articulated that perfectly. I so relate, and I felt it's funny what you said. I could sort of reiterate, which was Westlake Village was this new suburban community. The homes were models A, B, and C. There was a CC and Rs that restricted what color you could paint your homes. There were these beautiful green belts through. There were parks. It was kind of like they prescribed the way in which a kid would have fun. And meanwhile, my brothers and I, we were reading Skateboarder magazine and we were really interested in the Dogtowners. And
Sure.
And so, we wanted fun on our own. We wanted to find our own fun. We wanted to leap the fence and jump into someone's backyard to have our fun, not have like a park that's sort of perfectly, in this homogenized way delivered to us. So we really rebelled against it hard. I mean, I look at it now from an adult perspective, and I can see where, for parents, especially with like raising 4 children as my parents were, it would be in the perfect place. It would be less to worry about, right? Like we loved Santa Monica and Venice. That was like the playground we wanted. That's where we aspired to be. And yet my mother and father would have been losing sleep as we ran around those streets that were kind of crazy at that time. So we were in this sort of safe environment, but all we wanted to do was get out of it, and we were rebelling against it. But, you know, the other side is now like that place that I was so at odds with, because it was so kind of perfectly presented to us. I'm actually grateful because it really gave me this sort of like get out of suburbia spirit. Like I was just fighting my way out of the place, and sort of my ticket out was surfing. And once I started competing and doing well, I saw this path where I could, okay, you're in like the local contest, then you're in the state contest, then there's the nationals, get some good results. Your sponsors are going to be happy. You're going to get on the road. So my out from this kind of suburban mediocrity was my vehicle out with surfing. And I'm so grateful for it. And I was sort of myopically trying to win contests, but when I look back now, it was sort of this longer kind of odyssey that I was going to go on.
It's so interesting too, because it's I guess it's sort of like an issue sort of in modern times where it's like there's not a ton. I mean, not that suburban families are free of issues, but it's like, you know, as you pointed out, like this is a great place to raise a family. You can leave your doors unlocked, and it's relatively safe, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just absent like the natural world friction that I think some humans need to kind of like propel themselves. And so I found, as we talked about with music, but same with surfing, where it becomes this spiritual experience of like, this is the least curated thing I could imagine. Not so much the institutions built on top of it, although I guess that's a version of that, but just the ocean and how it's probably the most dynamic environment for a human being to exist in. And you're like, wow, you can go out there and you can do this thing that is occurring at the most violent part of this dynamic environment. This seems insane, and it's exciting. And I'd imagine it was similar for you when you found surfing, but I'm also curious as to what the story was when you got into surfing. How did that come about?
Yeah. So we did a family trip we were into skateboarding. We surfed a little bit in Santa Monica. We did a family trip to Hawaii in 1978, and we rode Waikiki on soft tops, and we got the buzz. And for me, it's funny. I always think about this. The surfing itself was fun, but what really hit me most was like being the end of the day surfing, my stomach all rash, like the tit rash from like laying on the board, sunburnt, you know, the salt encrusted probably because I didn't like bother to take a shower, and laying in bed and just having it all play back like this sort of afterglow and kind of like flashbacks of riding waves. And I was like, this is just the most incredible thing. So we got really hungry and, you know, for it there. And then with that trip, created this huge problem in our life, which was we lived on the valley side of the hill, and it was hard to get to the beach. It was like 20 to 30 minutes. So from Westlake, you know, you could go over Canyon Road to Zuma, or you could go over Malibu Canyon, Las Virgenes to Malibu. And we did a lot of that. And then we also went up to Ventura a lot. But yeah, all I wanted was the beach. And all I wanted was what you just described, which is like there was this kind of static, very predictable neighborhood that we lived in. And the kids were very cookie cutter. Or, you know, we could, once I got a taste for Malibu, it was the most exciting place ever because there was such a diverse group of people there at that time. And of course, the waves were different every day. And it was really, really adventurous. And it was sort of where, you know, once we got in the rhythm, our parents would drop us off, and there was a group of us, and it would be sort of getting dropped off at 9:30 in the morning, and we're going to come pick you up at 5. And so we had this day at the beach where we mixed with everyone, and we ended up meeting a lot of great surfers. And so it really I just craved to be there. The more I sort of found myself there, the more I hated where I lived. And it was like my head was always kind of going over the hill to Malibu.
That makes sense. But I mean, even what you just beautifully described is feeling sunburnt and feeling salt encrusted, like probably well before you dealt with any of us sort of dealt with any kind of existential ennui that's maybe become more pronounced in COVID of like, is this reality? Is this real life? What is life? It's like, it was like a physical reaffirmation of I am a person. Like I feel things from the natural world that is really exciting.
No, you're so right. And I think that at that age, we weren't necessarily conscious of that or would ever talk about it, but it was totally there. I mean, that was happening every day. And it was that wonderful thing that would happen over the years, which is like, we could be on the other side of the hill in Westlake and I could kind of look up to the sky and feel the wind in a certain way. And I would almost be able to know what Zuma was doing that time. This is like that. We've had a storm and it's lessened and there's this like mild south wind that would be an offshore wind. And yeah, like I learned, I almost gained like an animal like sixth sense from surfing and becoming so attuned and almost like knowing what the dropping tide was going to do to the sandbar and all that stuff. It was great.
It's interesting, on this podcast, we talk to a variety of people and lots of high-level surfers like yourself, and they generally fall into two camps. On the one side, you have these individuals who are part of surfing dynasties, whose grandparents were on the very first people on the beach, or the first people to surf this spot, and were board builders, and their parents were pro surfers, and they were born to it. And then on the other side, you get people who were sort of the first in their family to adopt surfing, and who had either cultural or geographic barriers to being able to do it a lot. I was talking to Courtney Conlog about this, and she's like, "Well, I grew up in Santa Ana, and I didn't grow up on the beach. We had to fight to actually get to the beach." And she's like, "It made me appreciate it even more." And I mean, even with someone like Kelly Slater, relative to the waves that he became so good at, places like Jeffreys Bay or Pipeline or Tahiti, like he grew up in Florida where there weren't really any waves like that. And so I do think I bring it up because it sounds like it was very similar for you in the sense of it wasn't given to you, and it wasn't also presumed that you were going to get to surf all the time or even get to surf good waves. And it sounds like it made you want it even more than it would have otherwise.
Absolutely. I mean, I had to fight for it on many levels. One, at that time, I sort of I sort of landed at Malibu in like 79, let's say. And there was still a lot of localism. And then being like from the valley, I mean, technically I wasn't the valley. I was north of the valley, but it was still the valley. The other side of the hill was the valley.
There's still some scars there, it sounds like, and I can see them because I have the same ones.
Yeah. So I had to kind of overcompensate. I had to earn it, via my performances in the water. I had to surf really, really hard. But then the other side is like pro surfing wasn't really a viable career path at that time. And so when I realized that's what I wanted to do, my parents weren't real pleased. And it was nice. I was sponsored by Quicksilver and Rip Curl, and I got, and Channel Islands, and I got discounts on my boards, and I got free clothes and free wetsuits. But there was this thing where like my father really encouraged us to go to college, and education was very important in my household. So it was, my dad wasn't thrilled. And it wasn't until I like traveled around the world for a couple of years and he saw me, I guess, growing and having these experiences that he realized, okay, this is okay. Right. So there was a lot of fighting for it.
In your amateur days, because you had such a stellar national amateur career, were there moments for you, being someone who, again, had to fight to even pursue this activity and pursue this life, were there sort of visceral moments for you where you realized, I'm pretty good at this, like I can do this? Was it, were there sessions, or was there conversations with people, or maybe sponsorships, or even contest results where you're like, no, I'm good at this?
Yeah, my amateur career was far more successful than my professional career. And there was a time when I started riding Channel Islands, Almeric Sports around age 15. That would have been like 1981. And they worked really, really well. And I just started winning contests all the time. And then in the WSA, which was the amateur body at the time, they had what was called a superheat. So they'd run all the finals, and then first from each one would go out all together. And sometimes I'd win the superheat too. And I really, I had a momentum, and I had a confidence, and I loved competing because I kept winning. And there was a really great thing at that time where the tallying of the score sheets was not done in private. You could actually like be looking over whoever's mom that was tallying the scores, seated on a chair with a little fold-out table in front. And I would just love to watch, like, if I were, say, color red in that heat, I would be like, first, big scores. And I thrived on that. And that was a great thing. And then right before I turned pro, there were these Echo Beach challenges that Quicksilver put on down in Newport that were kind of statewide events. And I won a couple of those. No, I had a really, really great rhythm. And I mean, look, like I had some nice results as a pro, but I didn't have the career I'd hoped for sure. But I buzzed on that thing, and I got my own small taste of the level of kind of like the snowballing confidence that you get. And I think about it when I look at the greats, right? And I think of like Kelly when there's, a minute and a half left in the heat and he needs an 8.7, and the probably just like the way his entire nervous system is probably relaxed and confident in a way that most people would be in a panic. And I had my own tiny version of that when I was kind of at the top of my amateur game.
Right. I do want to get into your observations being a professional surfer and touring, but we're going to take a quick break to get a word in from our sponsors, and we'll tackle that when we get back. So, hugely successful amateur career, early to mid 80s. Back then, as I recall, and as I've been, I guess, told, it was it was a big deal turning pro. Was that the case for you when you decided to do it as well?
It was a very big deal. There was there was a real delineation between being amateur and pro. I'll give it to you very quickly. So the first contest I ever saw was the 1979 Sunkiss Pro, which happened to be at Malibu. We didn't even know it was on. We were surfing third point all the time. One day, a couple of trucks pull up and they start pulling out scaffold, and they like build this judges tower, and they drape a Sunkissed banner on it. And then that weekend or that week or whatever it was, over the next few days, we watched this international pro contest happen right at our spot. Buttons Kaluhio Kalani won. It was fantastic. I suddenly realized, competing is a great thing. Like, I want to do this. All these guys are my heroes. So I surfed the following year. I surfed my first WSA event, and that was 1980. And so I did that for the 4 years. I was very lucky. There was a surfer from the Valley named Willie Morris, who was a few years older than me. Just as I was sort of hitting my straps as a competitive amateur, he had turned pro, and he was kind of learning the ropes of pro surfing and how to do it. Both as a competitor, as a traveler, on the road on a small budget, and also how to maximize getting pictures in the magazine and appearing in videos and movies. So yeah, it was a big deal, but I was lucky because Willie really showed me how it worked, and I knew it was what I wanted to do. And so my kind of sophomore and senior years of high school were just like, I can't wait to get out of high school and jump on this thing.
And when you talk about this thing, I mean, obviously the sport's gone through so many changes, but in the 80s and 90s, it was quite the world tour. Like, there were dozens of events that you had to find a way to get to. Is that correct?
So now we have the WQS and the world tour. Back then there was just simply one. There were trials, and then there was the main event. But anyone that had the money to join the ASP, which I believe was $100 for the year, and pay the entry fee, which was $100 per event. Anyone could join. Like, it could be your first day surfing, and if you paid that money, you could compete. So the trials, there were a lot of rounds in the trials before you got to the main event, where you actually earned proper points and where you earned some money. So yeah, it was much more open, and there were a lot of events. I mean, I think on one year there was like 29 events on the calendar. So we were jumping on airplanes all the time, chasing these events. But it was very, that period, like, I think of the momentum generation and beyond, let's say like the mid 90s onward, pro surfing was a viable thing. And there were people, if you were in the top 16 or above, you were probably earning money that you maybe be paving the way for your future and your retirement, etc. With us, it was sort of like, we know that reality is going to whack us over the head and we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do, but let's just run with this while we can. It was almost like we'd scam this thing. We'd like convince these sponsors to send us around the world. and we were appearing in magazines, and we were in our small way stars, and we signed autographs and all the rest of it. But there was no financial security we knew at some point we were going to have to like go to our second act or plan B in our lives and figure out what to do.
That's really interesting, and I mean, I guess I'm curious. I'm genuinely curious to know your answer on this, because we see it a lot where you have a very, very successful amateur surfer who even is maybe high profile in sort of media, and then they get on tour and it's a huge rude awakening for them in terms of how good sort of the elite level surfers are. Was that did you have a version of that, or were you kind of well aware that you're like, look, I have a ceiling and the really, really good guys are well above me when you hit the tour? Or were you entering the tour thinking like, I'm just going to keep getting better and the world title's not off the table?
No, I was a little bit of both. I mean, I'd surfed I'd been going to the North Shore, so I'd seen a lot of the best surfers in the world. But most of my surfing was in California, and I was kind of a big fish. And when the first leg of the tour I did was the 1986 Australia leg, and it started with the Stubbies at Burley Heads. This second event was the bow repairs for tires at Cronulla. Then there was the Bells event, and then I think it was the Coke Classic at Manly. And it was the year that Tom Curran won his first world title. But the biggest thing I found was the waves abroad were so much more challenging. Coming from LA County and having the surf be pretty tame for the most part. Being in like just even like spending a lot of time in Sydney, like once a week there'd be a big swell where you'd be jumping off some rocks, and if you timed it wrong, you'd get like hurled into rocks, and the ocean was just more alive. And I certainly found that in the North Shore as well. But no, I think like I had my contained little act on, head high waves where I could kind of do a lot of turns and do my thing. But I think where I was humbled most was just being able to land somewhere new, figure out that break, and find my rhythm with it. And I found a lot of the my fellow pros, like from Australia, were when the waves were a little bigger and the ocean was a little more wonky, they knew their way. They had more experience. They were able to sort of figure out that rhythm much quicker than I was, being from LA County, where the waves are often small.
I love watching, old films and old contests, because the surfing styles are so distinct and they're almost, provincial or regionalized, because you didn't have the information age, right? So the style was basically informed by the best surfers at someone's beach, and also based on the waves at that beach. And shapers didn't have access to global board design, and surfers didn't have access to global fitness or global technique. And you see some of these pro events back in the 80s or pre-information age, and you're like, they're all considered the world's best surfers, but they're so different compared to now, where it's not so much homogenized, but it's just everyone has access to all that information. And if a kid from Brazil wanted to see Tom Curran surf, like, in the 80s and 90s, they had to wait for the tour to come to town and watch him surf his beach. And he had to kind of retain that image and be like, oh, I surf like that. And now it's like you just go on your phone and dial it up, and you're like, oh, I can watch that and I can mimic the arm movements. And is that something that you recall as well, being on tour at the time?
Absolutely recall. And you said that so well. Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of path to becoming a successful pro is very well trodden at this point. We kind of know, the things that are good, the things that are bad. Of course, there are like more high tech levels of training or coaching that can get you there quicker. But for the most part, it's very clear. But I mean, truly, like when I was on tour, several of like my fellow pros from Australia would finish a heat and light a cigarette, like, and they drank hard, and they were like drinking Jack Daniels on the plane on the way to a contest. And there was definitely, I think that period that I was on tour was sort of straddling the fence. It had like one foot in the kind of 70s where surfers were sort of outlaws, and there was like, you were making a big personal statement, and it was kind of really like there were a lot of drugs, and it was and drinking too, and it was kind of a badge of honor to be able to do that hard. Like, there was like whatever Indonesia was pioneered, and so you had these almost like pirate-like characters where that was part of your signature. And then there was this new athleticism that, like, for instance, Tom Carroll and Tom Curran were very much a part of, where they were doing high-tech training things and they were building up their thighs and they were doing all this. And we were kind of straddling the fence. Like, I trained really, really hard, but then we would go on the on the Euro leg. And I remember the Euro leg, the first event was in Cornwall, England. And then it was Lacanau, France, Hossegor, France, Biarritz, France, San Sebastian, Spain. One year it was Sopelana, Spain. And then there was another event in Portugal. So it was like 6 weeks on the road in Europe. By the end of by the fourth week, everyone was partying so hard. I mean, people, we'd sometimes roll from like whatever nightclub straight over to the contest for our heat the next day. Like, I famously recall Rod Kerr pulling an all-nighter and surfing the first heat of the morning and riding a wave in Spain in like some shitty little beach break and weaving back and forth. And as he got to the inside with a crowd of people on the beach, he just like leaned over and vomited up all the beer from last night and just kept going down the wave. And that was, there was a lot of that. So so there was more of that regional thing. And there was all, there was a lot of hard living going on, and people were sort of unapologetic about it.
It feels like, and even in my experience being at the ASPWSL for 16 years and working at Rip Curl before then at the shop, but like echoes of that tension of romanticized pirate anti-hero behavior and professional athlete behavior, like that tension feels like it's still echoing in 2021. And I don't really, I guess I don't have an opinion on it. It's just fascinating to observe. And I remember, I think it's Bill Ballard's great documentary, in my opinion, Archie, on Matt Archibald. And I think it was Chris Morrow, as they were talking about Matt Archibald, he said something to the effect of, Matt was a marketing manager's dream, but a team manager's nightmare. And I'm like, that's so well put in terms of like maybe encapsulating the paradox that is professional surfing through the ages. Yeah. And it sounds like that was even more pronounced, obviously 80s and 90s.
I think it was there for sure. And, coming up at Malibu, I mean, I think Mickey Dora's influence was always there.
Sure.
And so there was this thing of not trying too hard, not if you were trying too hard, you didn't want to show it. I distinctly remember being in Australia for one of the events on the Gold Coast, and there was a surfer, Sean Reg Riley, and there was like a big night probably at one of the pubs the night before, and it looked like he'd come straight from the pub over, and he was wearing like his jeans, and he had like a studded belt. And maybe I'm imagining this, but I almost think like he might have even forgotten his surfboard, and he borrowed one of his friend's surfboards to go out and surf his heat. And that was like the coolest thing you could do. I think Michael Peterson helped that myth as well. And so I think that's like in the DNA of surfing is like a iconoclastic, non-athletic approach. It's like it's almost like cowboy thing where it's sort of like we're bucking this whole thing of like trying really hard, like a tennis player might, where you see them kind of shuffling and eating a banana before they go out and play. Like the generation I was a part of, for sure, there was something incredibly cool about that. But it's funny because all these years later, like I give so much credit to Tom Curran and Tom Carroll, who were kind of leading, they're the trailblazers for let's actually be athletic. Let's actually try really hard and lift our games accordingly. And like Tom Curran, when he joined the tour, his thighs blew up. Like he sort of assessed his physique and his technique and turned everything and did the double pump bottom turns. And he got this power. He was wearing like those OP bicycle shorts. It was like, he was totally happy to be a full blown athlete. And I think we benefit from that today,
I think you're right. But I mean, even like speaking personally as a fan, and I know like I'm not alone in this, there is this weird dual worship of both parts, right? Where maybe in the moment, I guess for my comp would be, you're either Team Andy or you're Team Kelly when you're coming up. And it's like, well, I'm Team Andy, But in hindsight, you're like, I have so much respect for both of them. And similarly with like, I know so many surfers that are like, I love Matt Archibald, I love Tom Curran, even though they kind of represented different, I guess, paths in terms of how they approached their surfing, because they both ripped, and that's sort of the commonality where people are like, that's cool. Like, it's very cool that they were ripped.
Yeah. I think, to some degree, it might be, I'm just thinking on my out loud right now, but it might be because surfing is not inherently a competitive sport. So if it's like if you play tennis, I mean, you can of course rally with your partner, but typically it's going to turn to a game, and you're going to walk off the court with a handshake, and when someone won and someone lost.
Right.
Whereas for like 97% of the surfing public, you go surfing, you have fun, and how well you did, it lives in this sort of abstract realm of, you quietly remember your rides, and you should have pulled into that one tube, you didn't, you fell on that one, blah, 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 blah. But for the most part, like, you're not being judged. There's no kind of concrete evidence of whether your surf was, you don't get a grade, right? And so I think maybe that somehow that like outlaw, iconoclast, pirate, whatever you want to call it, that archetype may appeal to the non-competitive surfer where there's something just like going against the idea of trying, like, the old college try, like that
Right.
that earnestness, is like somehow frowned upon or somehow uncool.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy that we're down this rabbit hole because I think about this, but I was even thinking out loud. Like I remember, like Dane Reynolds is maybe another parallel of someone who was not a Mick Fanning-esque kind of competitor in terms of how he approached his fitness or anything like that. But then, he would go out and he would just destroy lower trestles and blaze through the event and come out and be like, oh, I had some beers last night and I had some gas station food on the way to the contest. And that made it cool, right? Because there's this kind of like, I don't know if it's part of the human condition or like a nihilism inherent in, the surfing community where it's like, yeah, burn the whole thing down. Why not?
Yeah.
That's rad.
No, we love those people. I think it seems like every generation we have one or we'll find one. But it's a really good question. Like what part of us that appeals to? Yeah.
You mentioned being in high school and just wanting to break out so badly to join the tour. And I'm curious, obviously you've been around the sport for long enough and you've observed it a lot, and even sort of in the present day with, the homeschooling and all the sort of sprinter vans and all the, dads and moms with cameras down at lower trestles with their 12-year-olds. It's just such a wildly different atmosphere for young surfers in California than it ever was. And, inarguably, you're seeing very, very good surfers develop at a very, very young age, but at the sacrifice of a lot of things, right? In terms of like, well, if you want to get that good and you want to make the tour, like, probably shouldn't be smoking pot, or you probably shouldn't be, going to public school. Not that I'm equating those two things, but like probably shouldn't be playing other sports or whatever else. And it does feel like you lose sort of a balance in terms of creating who you are as a human being just because you have to become so specialized. Is that have you noticed that as well, just observing it lately? And do you have any thoughts on it either way?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's just, and it's more nuanced than this, but to put it in simple terms, it's sort of like the more the performance levels rise, the more you have to work really, really hard to meet that or stay up there. And that will be specialized, as you say, and at the expense of other stuff. And I guess like going back to my era, there was definitely a well-roundedness that was kind of respected. And I think in many ways, like the busted down the door era, like Sean, MR, PT, and Karen's Rabbit, they were all, they were smart. They were sort of characters. And that was respected. But I think now it's sort of like whatever you got to do to lift your game to that level. And sometimes it is, you have to live in a bubble and you have to sort of put the blinders on and make that the only thing you do. And it's great. It gives us great performances that are really, really fun to watch. But does it create interesting people? Does it create well-rounded people? Not necessarily. Yeah, and
happy people. Like I don't know. Like, I mean, and it's not just in surfing, but I'd imagine you can look at almost any discipline where it's like, yeah, that was those were decades of your life that you spent, in the pool training for the Olympics or whatever it is, or in the weight room, or no, and I don't know if it necessarily creates sort of happy people down the track.
I don't either. But what we're talking about resonates with me in a big way, just because I've written so much about surfing, and early on I was I would get assigned to write about the top athletes. And I sort of had this realization, which is a very obvious realization, but it's often like, the really, really great surfers, what they offer us, what their gift is, or what they kind of give to us is they're surfing. And it's great to watch them surf. But to sit down and try to get in their head and write a great piece, I often found myself sort of unfulfilled. And granted, like another writer might get really into the athlete mindset, but because I'd sort of done it already and lived that life, I felt like I'm more interested in characters on the periphery because there's often more there. And in the pursuit of competitive excellence or athletic excellence, often character was not, or personality and interests were not built in such a way that I wanted to spend a lot of time profiling these people.
That reminds me what I wanted to ask you too is, being on tour and seeing, these Tom Currens and young Kelly Slaters up close at events and doing battle with them in the Coliseum. Did you do a lot of comparing and contrasting between you and them in the sense of, obviously you were a high profile, a world-class surfer as well. Did you ever kind of look at what they're doing and think like, oh, maybe if I worked my thighs out a little more like Tom, or like he noticed that wave where I didn't notice that wave in my heat or whatever. Were you trying to figure out what you needed to do to get to that level, or was it more apparent that like that's just they're just a different species than me?
No, well, what's so interesting, and I can say that I experienced this firsthand, which is an interesting thing, which is like I looked up to these guys, like their pictures were on my walls. I had a pencil drawing that I sort of traced of a photograph above my bed of Tom Curren doing a frontside off the lip at, I think, Leo Carrillo that Jimmy Medico shot. And that was still above my bed while I was on tour. So I would go, chase contests around the world, in some instances compete against these guys. And their pictures were still on my wall. They were my heroes, and yet they were also my peers, and they became my friends. And that's a really strange dynamic. I think of like Kelly all the years that he was so far ahead, and it's sort of like, where do you look to for inspiration? You have to like dig into yourself or something. But no, I was a real observer. My highest ranking on tour was like the 42nd in the world at the end of the year. I had a couple of semifinal finishes that were really great and unforgettable, and I had the feeling of what it would be like to win an event. I like stood on a stage with a sea of people applauding and had champagne splashing over me as as the celebration went on. So I had like moments that I don't think of my career as a failure, but I didn't hit the high points that I'd hoped to. I didn't make the top 10, for instance, but I was close to those guys. I watched them both as a savvy athlete trying to like learn and pick up in what they were doing, and also and I see this now with hindsight, as a total kind of surf fan. And when I started writing about surfing, I realized like I'm kind of I'm more comfortable being an observer than I am like I was too in my head too much. I didn't have like the bastard desire, as Derek Hine used to call it. But it was fun to be so close to all that. And it was really just exciting to watch the kind of game face and, all the stuff we see in a good WSL event, where you see like whatever athlete with their headphones on psyching up for their heat. Like I tuned into all that. It was great fun.
The poster thing's so interesting too, because I'm glad you brought Kelly up as well, because, since I've been working at the WSL or at the ASP and watching him take on young wildcards or rookies or whoever, and in a lot of situations, surfers that should have had his number, whether it was a talent thing or, a wave selection thing or a heat strategy thing, and you're going, oh yeah, this kid's got him. And then for whatever reason, something bizarre happens and you go like, how did he do that? And you have to consider that that's the case. Like they're surfing against their heroes and deities in a lot of ways. And as you said, if someone doesn't come along with that bastard desire that's like, no, it's my turn now. Like, I'm going to go kill my god here and I'm going to take his place. Like, it's very hard to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely is. And I think it's a thing of character. And I remember like Sonny Garcia, there was a quote in the magazines right when he came on the scene, and it was something like, I'm going to kick some top 16 ass. And it was such a brash thing to say, like no rookies were talking that way. And of course Sonny did, and he did it big time. but yeah, it was to summon that confidence and to look at these guys that you'd sort of fixed in your head as your heroes, and then a couple of years pass, and they're suddenly your peers and your fellow pros that you're supposed to go out and beat. It was it was a fascinating dynamic.
So 5 or 6 years on tour, right? 80, 85, 86 to 91. Did you feel like your professional surfing career on tour wound down at a reasonable pace, or was it more like an abrupt stop for you?
It was a little of both. The one thing that I really enjoyed, and this was, I don't know if the tour is like this today, but coming from Southern California, and I'd made a name for myself here. Once I got on the road, I had the classic "you can't go home again" experience, where I'd sort of, after a year on tour, I came home. I didn't really, I felt like I couldn't connect with the friends that I'd grown up with. I was having these experiences that were kind of accelerating my life into something broader than Southern California. And I became part of this like traveling gypsy bunch. And the really great thing that we shared in common was like, we were the best, we were all the best surfers in the world. So I got so used to being around great surfing, and every time I got in the water, I was really like surfing at the edge of myself. And then I met a girl in Sydney, moved in with her. The last 2 years I was on tour, I was based in Sydney. My close friend at that time was Tom Caro, who lived in the same neighborhood. So when we weren't on the road, I hung out with Tom a lot, and I surfed some of the best waves in Australia with him, which was an amazing experience. No, when my career ended, I was close. I felt like I was on the brink of sort of breaking in. My career ended in 1991. It was the year that Kelly Slater was signed by Quicksilver, and there were several of us who were part of the fallout.
Sacrificed at the altar for
yes. And I was one of them. And at the time, it felt like my dream was over, and it was so heartbreaking because I really hadn't even thought of a plan B. The interesting thing, and I've thought about this and I've written about this, is like, if you have a plan B, like my father might have said to me at some point, Jamie, you gotta, keep something else in mind for when the tour days end. The more you have a plan B, the less you're kind of all in, and the less, you can't sort of comfort yourself in that way. It's like you have to throw everything at stake if you really want it. So right. I had so it's almost like you're going to undermine your pursuit if you carefully plot this plan B, at least in my opinion. So I was all in. It was all I really had. I didn't know anything else except for the fact that I was reading and writing, and I had a penchant for sort of writing while I was on tour. But when my career ended, it just felt like everything got ripped out from under me, and I went through a deep depression. I kind of sabotaged the relationship I was in. I like put myself, I almost like purposely took myself even deeper into this, like, your world is over and now you got to find yourself again. It was really, really dramatic, really depressing. And I was very lucky to find my way into writing for magazines. And then very quickly I went from my world is over to working at Waves magazine in Sydney, and it was in the inner city. There were other magazines published in the same house. So I was running around with a lot of writers, and I kind of, this, like, whatever you want to call it, artistic, creative side of me opened up. And I realized how intellectually curious I was, that I'd almost been repressing as a pro surfer. And suddenly, like, what felt like the end of my world was like, no, this is the beginning of your world. This is like everything gets to open up, and all the stuff that you'd sort of repressed in yourself or held back, you are able to explore those things because you don't need to be on this athletic treadmill that you've been on for a long, long time. And so I kind of was able to explore that, and it was fantastic. But when it happened, when the pro career ended, to answer your question, it definitely felt like just the world got ripped out from under me, and I was ill prepared for, being an adult. And I was only 25. I seemed old. That was the crazy thing.
Right. You mentioned, when you coming back to Southern California and feeling like a little bit like a man without a country, in the sense of the community that you grew up with, those people stayed there. And it's like, it's a little bit like a book club where everyone's reading the same book, and you've been away and you come back and you're like, I'm trying to catch up, or what chapter are we on? And it's like, the puzzle piece doesn't fit sometimes, and that lifestyle being on tour. And I've experienced this myself, and I'd imagine everyone that's traveled on tour, which is a bit of a traveling circus, experiences the same thing where it's hard to balance personal and professional lifestyles. And it's not to say that people that don't travel and people that sort of, grow up in a town and have a career and have a family don't have their own struggles, but it's just there's not really a model for the alternative, right? Where it's like, well, I'm going to travel the world, and then you think, well, how do I have a family and how do I have a relationship, or like how do I have a career that's not this? And I'm was that something that you kind of struggled with as well, like after the tour had finished?
Big time. There's a book that Nick Carroll wrote about Lisa Anderson, and it's a biography of Lisa Anderson. And there's one bit sort of early on that explains how she'd run away from Florida to the West Coast, and he wrote something to the effect of, Lisa was a runaway. We were all runaways. And I remember I thought, yes, we were all runaways. Like by being on the road all the time, you kind of evade a lot of stuff that you, if you stayed in one place, you would have to deal with. And I think about that a lot as a theme, and going back to, and I don't mean to romanticize him, and I know he doesn't have a great reputation over the last couple of years, but Mickey Dora had that famous quote, there is no problem so big or complicated that it cannot be run away from. And I think that was almost like that traveling gypsy endless summer lifestyle that we surfers love. He was almost commenting on that. And I think when I was on the road, it was really like, not only was I evading a lot of stuff in like relationships with people, romantic relationships with my family, but I was almost to some degree doing it with myself. It's sort of like, you just keep, the Rolling Stone gathers no moss kind of thing. Like you just keep going on, and there's something on the calendar in the next 5 days where you got to jump on a plane and fly somewhere new. And so you're having this super stimulating lifestyle, but there's also certain things that you're maybe not dealing with. And so when I stepped off the tour, for sure, I had to face a lot of that stuff. And I fell into a deep depression, and I think about it a lot because there are a lot of surfers from my generation who, are very open about their depression. Some have since passed away. Some have taken their own lives. But there really is this thing that happens in the sort of, it's like the highs you get are so high that it's a big ask to fulfill the rest of your life and get there again. Like it's, how do you do it? And it's real for sure.
It's interesting that note that you finished on there too, because it's come up in conversation, even with the late Andy Irons, who was diagnosed as bipolar, and in conversation, it's like, well, surfing in itself is a very up and down act. You're either getting all these endorphins and this dopamine hit from riding a wave, which is so exciting, or you're just sitting in the water, or even you get to go surfing, or you kind of have to go back to civilian life, or you're going on a trip, or you're at home, and it's this up and down thing. And I've seen it up close just for professional surfing, where if you take something that's naturally kind of manic and up and down, like the act of surfing or just the experience of being a civilian surfer, you can magnify that times, whatever you want for world-class surfers and, being famous and being rich and, surfing pipeline and then everything else, those swings just get so violent.
Yeah. No, I've been around long enough now to see how, when I was in the depths of the thick of my competitive career, I wanted so bad to win an event. I wanted so bad to make the top 16. And now there's the kind of thing. I remember Al Merrick said it to me when I stepped off the tour, and it was almost like he was saying, he didn't say this, but it was like, I'd never made the top 30. I've been on the tour for 5 years. And I told Al, I announced to him, and he was my shaper. We were very close. I said, I'm stepping off the tour. And he said, well, the higher you go, the harder you fall, which was basically like, you didn't go that high, so you don't have that hard.
It's not going to hurt that bad.
Yeah, yeah. But I've certainly seen where, the higher, the ex-world champions can struggle in their lives because they know these neurotransmitter bursts or dopamine bursts that are so incredibly high. They've won a Pipe Masters and looked in at a beach cheering, and they've been, ridden up on, chaired up the beach and all that, those moments. And it's like, okay, a joy at the time, but then later on you almost pay a price because you're going, where do I find such a sense of purpose? Where do I find that high? And then the other thing that I think happens is some of the like legends of the sport, as long as they hang out in the surf community, they're sort of being projected upon, and they're almost being frozen in time. Like I've definitely seen some pro surfers of the past where it's all, I think of the Hollywood Wax Museum, like the Bogey or the Marilyn Monroe wax figures of them at the prime of their lives. And it's almost like that's what's happening on some psychic level when they go to a surf contest or when they go to any kind of surf event, where it's sort of like, oh, you're the world champion from such and such. And the person in the present day is an older version of that, and they've maybe tried to change, but it's almost like their fans are trying to hold them to that place and time and position. And that's beautiful on the one hand, because most people don't experience that level of success, but it's also like not necessarily dynamic. It doesn't allow you the change that you hope for in a lifetime.
Totally. And I mean, I'm sure you could relate it to other sports too, but then there's this scalability issue in surfing, right? Where it's like, I don't know, like LeBron James or Tom Brady or Serena Williams or whatever, where it like the finance or the sponsorship and the fame and the media is so much higher that, post career, they're still very, very comfortable. But as you kind of pointed out, it's like, there's a little bit of grift and graft in professional surfing in the sense of like, I'm not necessarily here for the money, but like someone's going to fund me to go to Fiji and I'm going to get to have like invaluable just life experience. That's the whole grift, right? And then, and so kind of that post, deification phase of these careers is not necessarily comfortable for everybody. And you mentioned Lisa, and I can't remember if it was on this podcast. I can't remember if it was with Lisa or it was with MR, but we were talking about the Masters contest. I think it was with Lisa because I asked her if she would surf a Masters contest, and then she said, I actually asked MR about this, and MR's like, I'm not doing that. I already won my world titles. Like, the only reason that I would go there is for people who didn't beat me to try to beat me, and why would I do that kind of thing? And I'm like, that seems like the most well-adjusted answer you could imagine, where he's like, no. He's like, all the runner-ups can go and battle for a Masters title. Like, I don't need them, like, claiming my scalp at my age or whatever it is.
Right. No, it's interesting. I mean, I think that thing of, and I experienced my own small version of it, but you do, there's a level of attention that can be really, really addictive, and it sort of sets the bar. It like calibrates something inside of you. It lifts it to a place where you know that, and you can't ever unknow that or unfeel that. And so if that expression civilian life, like going back to civilian life, can just be such an utter letdown. And it's not so much like, I've heard the term PTSD used for ex-pro surfers. I don't like, it's not post-trauma, it's post-elation. It's post being like a superstar. And then it's hard to let go. And then the sort of, the byproducts of that can be so dangerous. There's like levels of vanity and ego and narcissism that are like not admirable qualities, but they are almost inevitable because you hit this real high in your 20s, let's say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, going back to the Al Merrick comment as well, there for some surfers, there are parallels in other sports to look at. But then when you look at someone like Kelly, who turns 50 in February and has really gone beyond the horizon in terms of what any athlete in any sport can achieve, and has reached levels that we can't even really fathom. I shudder to think what his experience would be just in terms of calibrating post-career. But, maybe I won't live that long to find out, because he doesn't seem like he's ever going to stop.
No, I mean, he's been such the anomaly. And I think certainly like the generation I came from, it was, 30, you were getting real old. So it is interesting. And I'm glad for that. I mean, it's good to see. And it as a middle-aged surfer, like, it's inspiring to see great surfing still being done. But I don't know. At one point, I sort of realized probably my best surfing days in terms of performance and in terms of the time I had and the waves I was surfing. It's I traveled around the world for 5 years. I got to ride some of the best waves in the world at the height of my physical fitness and athletic prowess. And I consciously went, I'm going to focus elsewhere, because I made a very conscious choice not to try to hold my spot at Malibu for the rest of my life and get the respect from that. I just went, I'm done. And I'm going to focus elsewhere, for better or for worse. But it's a tricky thing. I think it's inevitable. I think it's in everything. If we were talking about a law firm, there would be some partner in the law firm who's the great lawyer, but then there'd be some Harvard graduate hotshot that be just made partner, and he would threaten this guy. But I think somehow in professional sports, it's heightened because the lifespan is shorter. You know, typically like in midlife or much earlier, your career is over, and provided you live the normal lifespan, you're going to have a lot of years to fill. And you're going to always know that there was this elation, these highs, whatever you want to call them. And of course, like I'm speaking from my own experience. There are probably a lot of great athletes who hit their highs and they're very comfortable in their post-professional lives, and they're happy to be the legend, and they're happy to play golf and have people respect them and tell them how great they were. But I don't know. I don't. Doing something in the present that's interesting is what I'm most interested in personally.
We're going to get to that. I want to dig into post-professional Jamie Brisick here, but we're going to get one more break in from our sponsors, and we'll be right back. So you mentioned, it was serendipitous in that when your professional surfing career ended, your friend Andrew Kidman had a role for you as an associate editor at Waves magazine, and you're able to develop the writing part of your career, which I'm curious, actually, at this point in your life, what do you feel like you're better known for, as a professional surfer or a writer?
I actually don't know, and I don't think about it that much. I mean, I'm always just trying to get by. No, I mean,
that's a through line, yeah.
no, but I'm trying to make. I still feel like I'm trying to make writing work, and I say that I've been a writer for 25 years now, professionally more, and I've earned my living doing that. But at the same time, I'm not really looking back on it as I am like looking like the next thing.
Right. And you said you've been a professional writer for 25 years, and we talked about your family and your dad was in the academic world. Was there anything that was seeded in you before you became a professional writer in terms of your experiences, even as a professional surfer, that aided you in kind of making that leap?
Yeah, I didn't realize it, and now I see it a lot more. But my dad was incredible he was incredible in all ways, but he was incredible in terms of just when we were kids. First of all, he always wanted to travel. So we did a lot of road trips. We went to Europe when we were really young. We went to Hawaii. And we didn't have a lot of money, but my dad put a high premium on kind of experiences as opposed to material things. But when we would do road trips as kids, we would have flashcards. He would have flashcards up in the, he'd be driving and he would say a word, and we'd be having a contest to see who could come up with the definition for that word. So he was building our vocabulary from age 5 or 6. And then we, as a family, before bed, he would read to us books. So there were always books. There was always this thing of like, make sure my dad grew up in New Jersey, and he used to say to us, I grew up on the East Coast and the Northeast where there were seasons. And so 8 months of the year we were indoors, and that was where we cultivated cultural and intellectual interests. We watched movies, we read books, etc. You kids in Southern California, you play in the sunshine, 365 days a year. And he wasn't fighting against it. And of course, he chose to live here, and raise us here. But there was always a thing of like, keep your head in the books and make sure that you are literate. So I see that. And then again, while I was traveling on the tour, my dad would give me books specific to where I was going. So for instance, if I were going to France, he would find a book set in the place that I might be going to, or somehow Francophile in some way. And he would give that to me before I went. So there was always that. And then again, the interesting thing about being on tour was it was kind of like a fraternity vibe of all the surfers hanging out together, and we were kind of like elbowing each other, and we were we sort of buoyed each other up. We were very supportive. We were a family. But on the flip side of that, there were these long flights or there were these stopovers where you'd be alone. And I did some trips by myself, but I kind of like went, there was this inner life that was happening while this fraternity life was happening. And then of course, like my second year on tour, my brother passed away. So I was kind of trying to process the grief of that amid this like bunch of guys who were constantly laughing and making jokes. And I almost felt guilty for bringing something sad and dark to this group of people. It was like there was not really a place. It's strange to say, but I it was almost like I was apologizing for having this heaviness inside of me. And I think I sort of, with that, I almost like bifurcated. And there was one part of me that was able to just hang out with the boys. And there was another part of me that was going inward, and I read a lot and sort of cultivated an inner life, if you will.
Yeah, it's incredibly sad to hear that. And I have experienced versions of that being on tour, and certainly seen a lot of it on tour too. But it does speak to that plasticity of surfing and of being on tour in a lot of ways, where it's like, no, this is escapism. Like, we're not here for life, right? And we're not here for sort of hard things all the time. And as much as we can avoid it, even if no one's directly saying it, it is a little bit of a hive mind of like, nope, we're here for the good times, right? And it's impossible to maintain forever or even for a short period of time.
No, well, I have a couple of thoughts on that. One of the reasons why I love watching all the webcasts is I love watching all the great surfing, but one of my favorite things is to watch someone win their heat and come in and be interviewed. And there are these fresh faces. Often these guys are in their 20s or girls, but they've yet to have real life hit them. And I say this not, I wish everyone nothing but good things, but I look at it and I remember that innocence within myself. And you could just see the light in the eyes. And often these are people who have had incredibly great lives, right? Because they started surfing at age 9 or 10, sure. And they started winning contests and got sponsored. And then probably their whole families got around them and sort of helped them, usher them along into the pros. And so they're the center of their universe, and they're so good and they're so great, such great athletes. And you know, real life is yet to hit them. They've like, and I'm generalizing, of course.
No, yeah, of course. Yeah.
But oftentimes what you're seeing is a face that's yet to sort of been whacked over the head with reality.
Yeah,
and I enjoy that.
It's interesting that just it actually, I think there is a parallel just for me on the writing side too, because when I was younger, really romanticized the idea of being a writer and wanting to do it. And starting out after college and writing for Evan Slater at Surfing Magazine and freelancing and putting words together and sentences together, sure. But then I just hadn't really had any real life, you know, like I just didn't have anything. So I bring it up because I'm curious to get your impression of that as a writer between, I guess, kind of the academic and the technical skills needed just to write, but then also having lived a life, because you had lived a life and had ups and downs even by the time you got off tour. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I guess like how you balance that out in terms of value of becoming a writer and how much you draw upon in terms of, you know, really, because you can put sentences together and maybe it's not whatever, like Chaucer, but not to criticize, but you know, it's just not sort of highfalutin stuff, but it's all based on experience in a lot of ways, and which you think is more important in your professional writing career.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was on tour, all my pro surfer family, friends, we got along great, and as I said earlier, like it sort of lifted me, like it kind of like forced optimism out of me, or forced me to operate at this sort of level of kind of joy and happiness. But you know, for much of the time I was on tour, there was another part of me that was there, and I was maybe in denial of it. And when I stepped off tour and got into writing, it was almost like, okay, now you get to explore. Now you can go into this other side of yourself. And that was done both in my peer group, where I met a lot of people who were not, it wasn't the bro-bra surf world. I started hanging out with musicians and visual artists and and people where there was more, what's the word? There was more pathos. There was more sadness in people's lives that they were not in denial of. And so the sort of people I gravitated towards when I stepped off tour were very different to the jock kind of thing of that can be there in pro surfing. And then I think the other place where I was able to kind of explore that is just simply in reading, because so often like a novel will depict someone's inner life, and what I was reading in literature was not in the conversations that I was having on the beach with my surfer friends. And so I think, but let me just qualify, like the writing I was doing for the first 10 years as a writer was all light. When I say light, it was all sort of one-dimensional in the sense of I was writing for surf magazines. So it wasn't, right. I didn't join some creative writing program and start drawing from my life. That happened much later.
I think that's incredibly interesting though, right? Because you're obviously drawn to this, well, drawn to, but also in a lot of ways forced to be like, well, I have to do something else now, right? And surf writing felt like it was a nice kind of incubation space for you as you evolved into this next version of yourself. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so grateful because I think it kind of like piqued this interest in me. And while my bread and butter was coming from writing about surfing, and that was the thing I knew. And as I said, I kind of backdoored my way into it. I didn't go to an Ivy League college. I feel lucky that I'm able to earn my living as a writer because I didn't take a conventional education, have a traditional education. And I was just kind of winging it, and I'm still winging it. But I was writing about, I guess, like I was writing about surfing and earning my living there. But then the stuff I was reading was much broader than surfing. In fact, I kind of like very early on realized that I've learned enough. I not learned enough, but while I love surfing and I will always love surfing, there's so much that I missed out on in the pursuit of surfing. And therefore, I'm not going to be reading surf magazines all the time. I'm going to get my inspiration elsewhere. And then I started reading a lot more broadly. So I was writing for surf magazines. I was interviewing pro surfers. I was going on surf trips. But my head was interested in literature on a broader level, I guess.
Well, it's interesting. And I guess that's what I probably poorly articulated before, because you mentioned not going to an Ivy League school. But on the other end of the spectrum, I'm sure there are kids that did and then went to J school and come out of that not really having had like a intense life experiences, for better or worse, but for them, writing is almost theoretical at that point, and it's purely, they've just kind of incubated in academia. So it's probably a little bit of grass is greener for them, where they're like, oh man, I probably should have gotten my nose broken once or twice to actually have something to say.
No, that's such an interesting one because when I was young and the idea of being a writer was something I romanticized, and I felt young and I felt like I hadn't lived much and I sort of aspired to have life experience. Later life experience would come my way in ways that I wouldn't wish upon anyone. Sure. And so it just sort of happened. And I guess like some of the best writing I feel I've done have been about personal experiences that are not necessarily easy. I remember I wrote an essay for the New Yorker about losing my home in the Woolsey fire, which was 3 years ago here in Malibu. Mm-hmm. And I was speaking to a friend right after it happened, a close friend who I've known forever. And he was like, I'm so sorry about you. You lost everything. I'm so sorry about your house. But, you decided a long time ago you wanted to be a writer. And this is material. This is, what you don't want to have is like a mundane life.
Right.
So there's that side of it.
Did you ever feel like you had a choice though? Because I kind of go back to the beginning of the conversation where, because I relate to this in the sense of you grew up in suburbia and had to break out. You broke, and in a lot of ways kind of broke out of safety and the mundane and academia. And I'm being generalist and hyperbolic to kind of prove a point. It's not a knock on any of those things, but you broke out into the world and you're like, I did that because that was inside me, mm-hmm. and part of the payment of that is having really hard life experiences potentially.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So I moved, I was the editor of Surfing Magazine from 1998 to 2000. It wasn't it was a good, much like growing up in suburbia and realizing that's the place I want to leave. Those 2.5 years of being the editor of Surfing Magazine made me realize I want more than kind of Southern California surf culture. And so I moved to New York, and I met my late wife there very soon after. And I ended up living in New York for 11 years. But a couple of years into my New York experience, and I moved there to really try to make it as a writer and to write about more than surfing and to sort of just grow. And it wasn't going well. And I was really, really struggling. And at one point I had this thought that I need to get an MFA. And I looked into NYU, I looked into the new school. And I was thinking, if I get an MFA, I will kind of connect a lot of dots and fill a lot of holes in my general knowledge of the world. And therefore, when I hit those moments where I sort of feel like I have nothing to say as a writer, or writer's block, or whatever you want to call it, I won't feel them anymore, because I will be on this foundation of knowledge that I didn't get because I traveled around the world as a surfer.
Right.
Right around that time, I got a Fulbright Fellowship to study youth culture in Japan. And
wait, how did you get that? Just for the listeners. Oh, myself.
Well, so I thought it was a real long shot. A really close friend of mine, Sandow Burke, he's a surfer and an artist. He had a Fulbright to Brazil. And I went and visited him in Rio de Janeiro in 1998, 99. And I kind of understood what a Fulbright was. And I thought this would be great. And so I applied on many of the Fulbrights are academic, and they're for professors, and you go teach in a foreign country at a school. But there are some research and journalism grants. So I applied for one of those, and I learned about the groupism of Japan and how different it was to the individuality of the US, and how surf, skate, snow culture are assimilated. And I kind of wrote this proposal as to what I would do if I were to get the fellowship. Sent it in, and I got it, and it was a huge surprise for me.
And that's what, 2008 around there?
It was 2008, yes.
Yep.
It was this sort of validation, and it made me realize I don't need. And first of all, I realized to try to get an MFA, it was way more money than I had. There was no way I could afford it. I would have thrown myself deeply in debt in my mid-30s to try to do this thing. And so the Fulbright was kind of in lieu of, and I was so glad I got it. And what was great about the Fulbright is I went to Japan for 4 months, and it was sort of broad. I was really studying surf, skate, snow culture, which became sort of youth culture. And it was really just how to get a better understanding of Japan. And I traveled so much. So I was a good traveler. I traveled as a surfer.
Right.
But what was interesting about this trip is my objective was to learn as much as I could. And because the Fulbright is somewhat prestigious, I was able to kind of email luminaries, writers, scholars, etc., and say, hey, I'm here on a Fulbright Fellowship. Can I take you to lunch and talk to you about Japanese youth culture, let's say? And once I started doing that, it was a great education for me, or it was a great kind of realization of what writing can be. And it was this thing that, it's like just an opportunity to learn as much as I can, and anything I'm curious about, I can dive into. And the Fulbright, I remember coming back one day, like a very heady day of talking to interesting people. And I came back to my wife and I was like, God, I got to live every day like I'm on a Fulbright Fellowship. Like I'm just learning so much and I'm meeting so many interesting people. So that was a great thing. And that was one of those things where my imposter complex lessened for a minute, but it's back now.
But so if that's 2008, you went to New York in 2002. You had published 2 books already, right? That was
yes. Yeah.
We Approach Our Martinis with Such High Expectations and A Hedonist's Guide to Life, which explain those to me, but in the context of you said it wasn't going well in New York in terms of being a writer, but you're publishing books. That sounds like it's okay.
No, and there was another book with HarperCollins and Quicksilver called Have Board Will Travel, the his definitive history of surf skate. So no, I mean I had stuff going, but it just I never felt like I arrived, and I still don't, and I say that not in some strange woe is me victim complex sort of way. I just I don't know. That's just how I've always lived. It's like I don't I'm always a little anxious and trying to move things forward. And so while there was one version of that time where I could have taken stock in 2005 and gone, look, you've done this, this, and this, and you've published here and here and here. But I was really just looking kind of up, if you will, up at like what would be. I wanted to break in. I wanted New York Times, the New Yorker. I wanted like to see to reach those places, I guess.
Do you think there's anything that transfers for you between the athletic mindset versus the artist's temperament in that sense? Because it does feel like you had sort of, I wouldn't say competitive goals, but like outlining, like, I want to be validated. I want this investment in my talent and my work to be validated in the New York Times, and I don't, and I'm just curious to get your approach on that, because you've gone so much deeper in both spaces.
No, I mean, competitive surfing was an incredible foundation and education as to how to structure your days, basically. And I was like, I had to work at it. I mean, I as a competitive surfer, I worked hard. And as I say, that generation that I was a part of, there was the partying side of it, and I joined that later on. But through my amateur career, I was really focused and hardworking. And if I didn't go surfing, I would sprint pedal my bike up hills. I did these plyometric ways to, improve your fast twitch muscles in the backyard, like where I would jump off things and hop real high. I would swim laps in pools. I worked hard at it. And I think, and there was like the visualizing side of it, which was a really great thing. And there was a book at the time called Creative Visualization by Shakti Gawain, which feels a little like ethereal and new agey, but in fact at the time I was really grateful for it. And it was this thing of like imagining in your mind how to win the contest, and I did a lot of that. There would be like the NSSA Nationals, and I would go to sleep every night, and I would play the event in my head: the first heat, the second heat, the quarterfinals, the semifinals, the finals, stepping out of the water, having everyone cheering for me, and then getting handed the first place trophy. You'd run through the whole thing. And so I think it was a very positive exercise to do all that. And I've definitely tried to apply that to writing and that level of discipline. And I would say at this point, I am very disciplined. But as I said earlier, sometimes like unlocking something creatively or artistically, or in terms of writing specifically, it's not as clear cut as that. It's like for an athlete, you could almost like go to the Rocky 1. You could look at that and go, there it is. Like you run up those stairs and you cheer atop the, Chicago or whatever it was. And you inhabit that kind of dominant, triumphant mindset. Like when you're writing a book that takes you 3 or 4 years, and you're trying to find your way through, and you're trying to dig deeper into what you're really trying to say here, and you're trying to get out of the platitudes and the cliches and the surface level stuff and to plunge deeper and deeper, that process is not, it can take you to dark, sad places, or introspective places that are just inherently melancholic because they're sedentary and you're sitting in a chair alone in a room all day, which is very different to like, riding your bike up a hill in the sunshine to train for an event. So they're like the athletic and the artist temperament. There are definitely some similarities, and there are places where I think they're very different at the same time.
You've mentioned all three of these, and having an uncurated life, and no one really does, or no one really doesn't, right? But you lost your brother in 1987, and your wife in 2013, and your home in 2018, in the Woolsey fire, and the story that you brought up about it ends up being material, but in all cases, and I'm sure those aren't the only ones, do you find that writing is also like an opportunity for you to process as well, even if it doesn't go anywhere? Do you feel like there's any catharsis for you in actually pursuing it?
Absolutely. And yes. And I think that's the one thing, I have a friend, a writer, his name is Jeff Dyer. He's English. He's one of my dear friends, and he's one of my heroes. And I remember being at a literary festival in Cornwall, England, and he was part of a talk about failure. And he described pitching to, I believe it was Esquire magazine, a story about skydiving. And the plan was he would learn how to skydive, and he would go up in a plane and he would jump out by himself and he would write about it. And he describes doing all the preparation and all the training and then getting up in the plane. And then the guy who taught him opened the door and said, okay, jump. And he had the parachute on his back, and he just completely chickened out. And he explained how his plan to skydive was an utter failure. But then he wrote about his failure to skydive, and the piece itself was a total success, and everyone loved it because it was funny and charming and blah, 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 blah. Writing has that possibility in a way that when I was a pro surfer, you either won the event or you didn't, but there was no, maybe you could argue that in some abstract way down the track, there's some redemption that you have because, you were a good sport or you were a good person or there was something you learned. But in a tangible way, like you either lose the contest or you don't, or you either win the contest or you don't, right? Whereas with like drawing from your own life experience in art or writing, there are many ways where you do get redemption, where you do get a sort of second chance, or it gets a second life. So for sure, going into some of the things that have been tough in my life and writing about them have been great in every way. But again, to reiterate what I said earlier, sometimes I don't know whether this is just total self-indulgence and it's digging myself deeper into a kind of like sad story, or whether I might write something that could connect with people and be very meaningful and helpful,
In 2015, you published Becoming Westerly, the transformation of surfing champion Peter Druin into Westerly Windina. And you mentioned, and we can edit this out if we're not allowed to talk about it, but you mentioned you've been developing this into a film for a number of years. Can you tell us a little bit about how that project got started, your experience working with Westerly, and what the timeline is on the film's release?
Sure. So 2009, I traveled to Australia. At the time, right before I went, Scott Hewlett, editor of the Surfers Journal, who's a dear friend, and I read a lot for the Surfers Journal. I said, I'm going to Australia. Any pieces that might be interesting over there? And he said, well, Peter Druin is living as a woman. That could be a great piece. So in the month I was in Australia, when I arrived, upon arrival, I think I started trying to find Peter Druin, who was Westerly Windina, and got a phone number, called Westerly cold, said, I'm Jamie Brisick. I write for the Surfers Journal. I'd like to write a profile of you. And Westerly agreed. And so I traveled up to the Gold Coast, met her for lunch, and had this great talk about this transformation that had happened, and wrote about it for the Surfers Journal. And it was a successful piece. I got very good feedback on it. And then shortly thereafter, Westerly was featured in the Sydney Morning Herald. And there was a director living in Los Angeles, a good friend of mine. We were working on some projects, and he's Australian, and he saw the piece and he read my piece and he said, what an interesting story. Maybe we should make a documentary. Or so I can't remember who said it to who first, but we came up with this idea of let's follow Westerly and make a film. And so that started in 2011. And so it's been it's been 10 years. And there have been so much has happened. We followed Westerly to Bangkok for gender reassignment surgery. We then documented sort of coming back from that, and then let some time pass to see sort of how, what the changes were. And we recently finished, and we unfortunately finished just as COVID hit. So we sort of put it on the back burner, but now we're very excited. It's going to have a life in 2022. And the film is done.
I'd imagine that the surfing and artistic community in Los Angeles is not reflective of the broader surfing community around the world. And this kind of speaks to something that I'm fascinated about. We talk about a lot on this podcast, where the idea of progressive nonconformity being inherent in surfing as an idea and surfing as a culture from the outset is maybe a fallacy in a lot of ways. And certainly a lot of the institutions that have been built on top of surfing, and I'd include the sport from time to time, really skew towards exclusivity, conservatism, closed-mindedness in a lot of ways, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, which is a bizarre paradox that kind of plays out in real time all the time, in my experience. I'm curious, just in terms of if you've experienced any resistance to even the topic of Westerly Windina in surfing circles after this came out.
No, when it first came out, absolutely. And it was, to be honest, I was really championing Westerly because I feel really lucky to have grown up in Los Angeles, honestly. And I think it's my family and my friends and influences. And it's also growing up at a city beach that was very diverse and very open-minded, I think. Let me say this, open-minded relative to a lot of like surfing locales around the world. But when I was a pro surfer and I was on tour, I realized so many of the great surfers in the world come from small towns on the northern New South Wales or the south coast of Australia, and so you don't get the diversity, and like people's experiences are just a little bit more limited. And I think coming from Malibu, I did get there. The thing, it's good and bad. Like a lot of the surfers that were much better than me and were beating me, they came from places where if you were, where surfing was kind of the only thing to do in that small town, or it was the center of the town. And the focus was there. When I was coming up, surfing was one of many, many things you could do. And of course, like the waves were not of a quality that necessarily bred you for that. But what I did get is an open mind. And I think the type of people that I ran around with when I was younger were diverse. And I didn't have those prejudices that a lot of surfers do. But so when I first wrote the Westerly piece, I mean, so many people did not understand it. I interviewed people who said very disparaging things. In some instances, I didn't even use their quotes because I didn't want to, incriminate them, or they would be even more incriminated now, given the way the world has changed. But yeah, it was unfortunate to see how narrow-minded people are in the surf community.
It kind of goes back to what we were talking about with generalists and specialists and being well balanced in the sense of, and I don't think this is just surfing, but that's what we're talking about here. But it does feel like it is set up to fail in the sense of, okay, if there is a community where there are great waves and there's not a lot of diversity and there's just not a lot of like different thoughts and perspectives and experiences being thrust upon that community, but it's developing world-class surfers who end up through, industry and sport becoming sort of icons of the community. They are specialists, but they are probably at higher risk of having closed-mindedness or prejudice or whatever else because of the way it was set up, and I think about this a lot in the sense of how do you kind of balance that out in a way that doesn't necessarily compromise the entertainment product, although that should probably be the last priority, but just creates kind of happier and more balanced humans that can at least have, understanding and openness towards their fellow humans.
No, I hear you. I mean, surfing can be really tribal. It can be so competitive, and to be an alpha surfer, there's like levels of testosterone that you need to hit, and so it does. I don't like this term because it sounds disparaging, but it can be very jock-like. It can be. There's a. It's about like triumphing over your fellow surfer, and the very pursuit of that is not necessarily like a highly sensitive one. And if you look at any lineup, if you look at a crowded lineup, typically like there's a certain mindset that it takes to be the alpha surfer, to catch all those waves, to be the best surfer. That is that may, how do I say, it may be at the expense of some of those sensitivities,
Sure. Well, geez, I feel like you and I could probably talk for weeks because I have so much to talk to you about, but maybe we'll save it for another time or another dinner. But we do have a couple of questions from the Instagram community, so I'm going to get to those. The first question is from @Alden Milby, who asks, in regards to metropolis or cosmopolitan surf culture, how do tight-knit communities survive in big city crowds?
Interesting question. I don't know. I mean, I think, I think growing up in LA, there are all these sort of like substratas of surf scenes, and the biggest one is probably First Point Malibu, and that's encompasses a lot of people. But then there are little breaks around where there are smaller communities. But I hope I'm not understanding the question 100%, but I think that's it. But I think you find your break, you find your people, and you stay in it.
Makes sense. Second question is from @Joel Sinton, who asks, if you can only surf one of these for the rest of your life, carves, tubes, or airs, what would that be?
Given that I can't do airs, it's fairly simple. I think, that's a great question. I think I just sit in the barrel.
That's a good answer. And the last one from the Instagram community is from Oh Hi, It's Kim, who asks, I'm interested in your take on the extremely limited number of voices allowed in surf journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think surfing in general can feel very, very insider. I think we're going to get more. I think like it's definitely tipping in the right direction. Yeah, I have no easy answer for that. I think that there should be more, and I think there will be more.
I agree. And it probably is reflective of media inside and outside of surfing as well, where at least in surfing, there's been this contraction in terms of media outlets, right? If you probably compare to when you were getting into it in the 90s, there's probably just more outlets, even though it was probably still a very limited, profile of writer, white male, more than likely, right? But then the information age in a lot of ways is almost democratized writing in the sense of you can be anyone and you can have a Substack or you can do whatever. It's just about kind of getting your following up and getting an opportunity to write. Yeah,
for sure. And I think we're going to get more and more of that. And I think there will be more voices and more diverse voices for sure.
So we have one final round. This is the lightning round presented by Michelob Ultra Pure Gold. So these are 10 questions for you to answer as quickly as you can. If you could only have one board set up for the rest of your life, single fin, twin fin, thruster, quad bonzer, or finless, which would you choose?
Thruster.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Burrito or pizza?
Burrito.
Last book you read?
Oh. Last book I read. On Freedom, Maggie Nelson.
Best surf film ever?
Storm Riders, Jack McCoy.
One wave you never have to go back to?
I don't think there's any wave I wouldn't go back to, but if I had to pick one, no, I'm passing.
If you only get to surf one wave for the rest of your life?
Malibu, First Point.
Best person to share a lineup with?
Jordan Tapas.
Worst person to share a lineup with?
Johnny Boy Gomes, 1986.
Last one. Finish this sentence. I will next achieve a state of happiness by?
Going surfing this afternoon.
Jamie, thank you so much for coming on the lineup. Where can people check out your writing?
JamieBrisick.com. I'm on Instagram, my name, and I have forthcoming books and online, I guess.
Great, man. Well, I really appreciate the time, and I appreciate your candor and your insight, your brilliance. I've been a big fan for a long time, and this was an absolute joy and honor for me to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate it, and it was a joy for me.